All right, all right. Enough of this serious stuff. what is what is that? That's some kind of bill. I hope somebody's going to pay it. I'm not planning on. Anyway, today I meet you at the gate with one of my favorite books of all time, and that's saying something. The Star is My Destination by Alfred Bester, one of the most amazing writers that ever lived. And I was talking about Neal Stephenson the other day. Alfred Bester came first, and oh my God, what an amazing mind the guy had. He was a writer, and then he was an ad man. Well, yeah, he was an ad man. He wrote comic books. He wrote radio plays in the middle of the century. And then he started working with Holiday magazine, which used to be a thing. And he wrote for Holiday for 20 years, 17 years, something like that. And then he went back to writing science fiction. And he has written he's written a number of books, but the three books that really made him famous are The Demolished Man, the first one, which is not my favorite of the three. Star is My Destination, which he published in 56, I think, is my memory of it. 56, 55? 56. Yeah, 56. And The Computer Connection. I might have... I've got a copy of it here. This is what it looks like. This is a super ugly cover. It's a shame, but anyway. That's a great book. And I might just talk about it. But today... Star's My Destination. Oh boy. It was also made into a comic, or sort of an illustrated, kind of comic by Howard Chaykin. And I do really, really like and admire Howard Chaykin's work. I adore it. It's not really adorable, but I do really like it. I think it's amazing. But I think that adaptation of Bester it was a good try. But I think it requires, yeah, it was a good try. The book is very visual, and which makes sense. It's a story of a man named Gulliver Foyle who lives in the 25th century. And in the 25th century, by the 25th century, the human race has learned to jaunt. That is, we've learned to teleport, but we've only learned to teleport for reasonably short distances. So you can teleport like 100 miles, 500 miles, 1,000 miles. So what that means is that there are jaunt stages all over the world. And it means that you have to basically memorize. This is really intriguing because this is what, he saw some things and not others. It's always amazing. So the whole society is like, what if you change one thing? What if people could teleport? And then the whole culture he reorganizes based on that. Demolished Man is the same thing. It's like, what if there really were telepaths? But the telepaths were an elite, what would that look like? And what if they had different strengths? And that organizes the culture. Anyway, in this case, it's what if you could teleport? And you had people who could teleport, 100 miles, 500 miles, 1,000 miles. Well, first of all, you'd start building stages all over the world that allowed you to basically were stations that allowed you to teleport from station to station if you had to go places. The second thing is you could live wherever you wanted to because you could get everywhere, you could get anywhere instantaneously, almost instantaneously. So if you want to, work on the West Coast or live on the West Coast and work in New York, you can. Which was something which was people were becoming aware of because for the first time, really commercial transatlantic flight was available in the post-war world. And by the mid-50s, the beginning of the idea of a jet set, that there actually were people who could get on planes and fly around, and they could sort of fly around with each other to different places in the world. And this is how they created their own moving world. This basically is the idea, except it's anywhere. So Gully Foyle, as he's called, Gulliver, right? So you can just see where a hero protagonist from Stevenson is going to come from. So Gulliver Foyle. So Gulliver, the traveler, right? The traveler, the one who goes everywhere, who sees everything, who sees the smallest, the Lilliputians and the Brobdingnagians and who goes to like castle in the sky in Laputa, which hovers over places and extorts them for their food and water, and the land of the horses. Horsey Heaven is one of my professors, my first professors I ever learned from. He was great. The Houyhnhnms or the Houyhnhnms are supposed to be they're supposed to sound like a horse whinny. Gulliver from Gulliver's Travels, right? So Jonathan Swift's 18th century book about basically you travel and you find out how crazy people are at home because you basically meet terrible versions of them out there, So that's one of it. And foil, the foil of your somebody's foil, it's spelled differently, but it's the same idea. That they are your patsy, basically. They are your cover. They are that they are the person who foils you. But usually a foil is somebody who you use them, and they are. So we talk about people being, he was. Like they're not your object, but they are your instrument. I guess is really the best way of putting it. Let's see what good old Merriam-Webster thinks a foil is. I'll probably say, wrap your fish up in it, put it in the oven. Oh God, it's always an education. Foin. What is foin anyway? A foin is a fork for spearing fish. It's archaic. It's also a fencing pass. Archaic, 15th century. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Okay, a foil. Light fencing sword, tobacco covered with foil. Right, yeah. Foil. Trample. What? Okay, that was ironic. I was foiled in the middle of reading about foils. Okay, so foil. Let me go back to this. To trample, frustrate, yeah. A very thin sheet. Someone or something that serves as a contrast to another. Okay, yeah. Okay, that's... All right, I'll go with that. Okay, it has other meanings. Whatever. So Gulliver Foyle is this very unusual sort of brute of a man, and he's left stranded. Apparently he's in a space accident. That is, he's in a space crash of some kind, and he's left stranded. And so the beginning is amazing. He's left stranded in this locker, which is the only thing in the spaceship that has any air left. And he doesn't have a working spacesuit, so every morning he's got to get into his spacesuit, and once a week. So he crams himself into the spacesuit, and he has no tanks for the spacesuit, and he gets as much air into it as he can, and then he goes out, and he has to go down basically part of the spacecraft to the air tanks, get an air tank, and he says he has no way of knowing whether it's already full or already exhausted, whether he would fight it back to his locker only to discover that it was empty and his life was ended. Once a week he endured this game of space roulette. There was a roaring in his ears. The air in his spacesuit was rapidly going foul. He yanked a massy cylinder toward the ballast hatch, ducked to let it sail over his head. This is great, because this is really, at this point, people haven't actually been in free fall. So Bester's imagining all this. He's getting it right. 4 minutes had elapsed. He was shaking and blacking out. He guided the tank down the main deck and corridor, pulled it, and bolted into the tool locker. What an amazing word, a bold. Oh, you can just imagine it, bowling it in. He slammed the locker door, dogged it, found a hammer on the shelf, and swung it thrice against the frozen tank to loosen the valve. Foyle twisted the handle grimly. With the last of his strength, he unsealed the helmet of his spacesuit, lest he suffocate within the suit while the locker filled with air. If this tank contained air, he fainted, as he had fainted so often before, never knowing whether this was his death. Then he wakes up. And one day, while he's in the spaceship and he's barely surviving, he's passed by a spacecraft called the Vorga. And so he sees the spacecraft coming towards him and he starts signaling it. And Vorga goes past him. "You pass me by," he said with a slow mounting fury. "You leave me rot like dog. You leave me die, Vorga. Vorga T1339. No, I get of here. I follow you. Vorga, I kill you, Vorga. I pay you back. I rot you. I kill you, Vorga. I kill you, filthy." So he's this complete brute. So, he can't even talk. I kill you. And then he becomes this, because he's sort of this typical Bester's hero. He's this very unusual, like all of us, this is Bester's sort of philosophy, which makes him very optimistic, that all of us basically are incredibly unusual. And if the door is open, if just the door would be opened to our internal self, our best self, and Bester was a Freudian. So there's a lot of connection here between the sort of the idea of like, well, we just need to become. Then we'll wake up, and so the rage begins to wake Gullyfoyle up, and he begins to figure out how to impart spin to his ship, and he begins to. So he makes an air tank, he makes a harness and an air tank, and he begins to get free. Now, something else happens that we don't know, because there's an overall mystery to this. And so he gets back to where he's on his way back to civilization, such as it is. But he crashes in the asteroid belt. And the book is so full of amazing things. He crashes the asteroid belt, and he crashes with the scientific people, which are people who have been left behind. There's been a spaceship has crashed on one of the asteroids, and the people who survive don't remember anything, so they just begin this civilization, and they leave they leave a race of people who call themselves the scientific people, and they're hilarious. So it's sort of this mashup of like all these crashes are in this one place. 2 centuries of salvage were gathered in this hive: armories of weapons, libraries of books, museums of costumes, warehouses of machinery, tools, rations, drinks, chemicals, synthetics, and surrogates. And this is very much, it's just breathless prose. A crowd around the litter was howling triumphantly, so that Foyle crashes his ship into this. And so they're like, okay, we're going to kill him. Quant suff, they shouted. Quantity sufficient, right? But they don't remember what these things mean anymore. And then they all recite: ammonium bromide, grams 1.2, potassium bromide, grams 3, sodium bromide, grams 2, citric acid, quant suff, sufficient quantity. Quant suff, the scientific people roared. Quant suff. Foyle fainted. And then he is introduced to the scientific people. And the names, and this is so smart, the names all have O's in them. So Joseph is the leader of his people. And they don't know what to name Gully because they don't know who he is. He's passed out. So they name him Nomad, which is good. But they tattoo Nomad on his forehead. And to indicate the sex of a person, because everything is about identification in a scientific model, they put they use either the sign for male or the sign for female with the O. So you can see it here, I think. Here. You can see, so Polly has the sign for female on the O. Moira. What the hell is that? I can't read that. Joan, right. choose. The scientific people practice natural selection. Be scientific in your choice. Be genetic. So they just using science just become this sort of cargo cult religion. They shaved him, they bathed him, and then they put this terrible tattoo on his face, Nomad, and they tattoo him with a tiger's mask. Now in Britain, the book was called Tiger, which again connects with Watchmen, which we were talking about. I was talking about yesterday. Fearful Symmetry, right? It's the same thing. And so he has this tiger's mask on his face. And so then he leaves behind that and he arrives back on Earth. And on Earth, he begins to, he doesn't have any memory, he doesn't remember who he is, doesn't remember what's going on. And he falls into, well, he starts trying to get revenge on Vorga because he doesn't know anything about anything. He thinks that Vorga, the ship that left him behind, is guilty. So he tries to kill Vorga. And so he, in the meantime, then, so that's Gallifloy. And then we shift to the people in power. And the people in power are divided between the outer systems and the inner systems. The inner systems basically are the 9 planets. Well, there still were 9. Poor Pluto. And the outer systems, which are basically the planets outside. So basically there's a civil war on. And the war is being fought over Pyre, Pyre. And Bester's very clever with the language. It's basically, so it's not just a funeral pyre, but it's also an atomic element. And it is this based, fundamentally, what it is to this book is nuclear power, in the sense that it is to the 25th century what nuclear power was to the middle of the 20th century. And it can be exploded only by thought. So you have to have the right frequency and you have to have the right thoughts in your head, and then you send out waves and the waves explode this stuff, and it's incredibly explosive, incredibly damaging, incredibly destructive. So there's a fight on and there's a private war on for Pyre between the outer system and the inner planets. And so it's a spy story, sort of. And somehow Foyle is going to get into this, the middle of this thing, as he tries to kill Vorga. And he will learn who was piloting Vorga. But in the meantime, we spend time with the elites, and the elites are these hilarious, sort of the super rich of the robber barons, basically. And that's what Bester's based them on. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you had the first super rich in America. Really, they were, in many ways, the first super rich in the world. Nobody had been this wealthy before, unless they were monarchy. And even then, it's doubtful whether they had this much power. So the people I'm talking about were people who, started the oil industry, steel, railroads, mining. They owned, like Hearst did own newspapers, but newspapers were a side thing. I mean, he was mining, and they were looking for oil, and Rockefeller was oil money, and Carnegie was steel, and so on. So the robber barons were famous in what was called the Gilded Age, between roughly 1880 and sort of it went on to about 1910, just before World War I. Depending on your mileage may vary. And these robber barons had more disposable money than anybody had ever had up until that point. They were truly super rich. Diamond Jim Brady, they say the Carnegie, the Rockefellers, and so on. So if you saw All the Money in the World, I think, which was the Getty Foundation, the Getty Trust, which is about the kidnapping of one of the Getty children, and he won't pay. He won't pay the kidnappers. That kind of money, it's I mean, they could buy castles, and they could buy, they amassed these incredible art collections and so on. These are the people that Bester's like, that's what it's going to look like. So it's very prescient, right? But he also sees what makes them so powerful is they're corporate. So the main villain is Preston of Preston. And Preston of Preston runs convenience stores, basically. And it's not unlike, this is really where in Demolition Man, which is kind of a charming little movie, early Sandra Bullock, late Wesley Snipes before he sort of went crazy. I don't know what was wrong with him. Anyway, and Sylvester Stallone, of all people, is sort of the foil, ironically, for Sandra Bullock. The Sandra Bullock character is this sort of, genial cop who's got a complete fetish for the 20th century. And, and then Sylvester Stallone is frozen and he wakes up. And what a crazy movie. But at one point, one of the elite says to Sylvester Stallone, I am going to invite you out, at my expense to Taco Bell. And Sylvester Stallone is like, what? Taco Bell. But it turns out that Taco Bell is this extremely high-end restaurant. It's like, 2 centuries later. Because there have been these fast food wars. And only 2 are left. I can't remember what it is in Taco Bell and Wendy's. I can't remember what the 2 brands are. Pizza Hut or something like that. And it's become this very high-end eatery. Well, Preston of Preston is the same thing. And he has the Mr. Prestos. And he has people who have themselves physically changed to look like him. And then there's a franchise. And it's a very clever book. This is 1956. Oh, my God. And he sees ahead to all this stuff. And, okay. So they have a livery. So they've sort of gone back to sort of 19th century ways of showing power, so that he's got a watch chain and he's got a watch, and the clan has a livery, and they have costumes that all look the same, and uniforms, but they be beautifully made and so on. And so Mr. Preston, this is somebody who comes in to interrupt him. I'm from the Internal Revenue Department. I must see you this morning. Preston cut him short with an icy stare. There are thousands of Prestons, he pronounced. All are addressed as Mr. But I am Preston of Preston, head of a house and sept, which is like a clan. First of the family, chieftain of the clan. I am addressed as Preston, not Mr. Preston. Preston. That's great. And then, so they're just as crazy as the scientific people, right? I mean, it's the same thing. So what's interesting, so then there's all this jaunting, they're jaunting back and forth, and then slowly Foyle begins to get he slowly gets smart enough to begin to sort of get a grip on what's going on, but then he's picked up by the services and they put him in Juif Martel, which is this sort of black site. It's a black site prison, and the prison is literally black. There is no light in it anywhere. So the inmates are kept in the complete darkness, and the wardens, the guards, wear infrared goggles. It's just so damn smart, and it's so clever. So it's sort of this Count of Monte Cristo story, which is mashed up on. So he stays in the prison, and of course he stays in the prison, and he finds a whispering chamber so he can connect with a woman who's another crook who's also very bright, and very slowly she educates him, and he begins to learn. But he's quick. He's so quick. And so he's gone in as a sort of brute, and he slowly becomes more and more educated. He breaks out of prison, and then he has to get his tattoo removed. But then to control, because when he gets angry, the blood rushes to his face, and it makes the tattoo bloom. So if you're going to get a tattoo removed, as you know, you have to take a needle, and you still have to do it this way. Digital won't help us with this. You got to take a needle and dip it in bleach, and then go into the pore that has been inked. And you got to do that for every pore, right? So it's this incredibly painful business. And you have to bleach out everything. But there's a stain that's left. So his face is clear, so he can't be identified because of this tiger mask, which marks him. because he has to get rid of it. But when he gets enraged, and he gets enraged all the time because he's a brute, he flushes, and the flush makes the tiger mask appear. So he's got to learn to control his temper. And basically that becomes his conscience. So he has to learn meditation. So he starts slowly to get an education. And then he disappears. And he reappears as 4 Mile of Ceres. And Bester wrote the book when he was in Britain. So he always used, and this is still a good idea, he used phone books to get names, which is, as I say, it's a good idea. If you're writing, and you're like, what should I name so-and-so? It's like, phone books. Well, these days there aren't any phone books. So look online, look around for names. Be careful about that. But, you can always Google a name that you choose if you're writing and you think, I want to write. Google it. Check out that if somebody doesn't have this name and you're not reminded of something. I did this once. Oh my God. I realized it just before I sent this article out for this story out for publication. Well, I submitted it for publication. Never got published, so I didn't have to worry. But anyway, I was like, this name was really familiar. I had just changed it slightly. It took me, 10 years later, I remembered. There was no web at the time. Duh. So 10 years later, I was like, oh, I identified who it was. Whew. I don't think he would really have cared if he'd been named as a protagonist in somebody's science fiction story. I don't think he was already, quite a character. So basically, then it's a race to get a hold of Pyre, and so Foyle disappears, and he reappears as 4 Mile of Ceres. So all the names come out of these British phone books, and so that's why they have these. Like, there's a character named Dagenham, and so on, Wednesbury, and so on. But the brands and Bester is so on with the brands. So they meet, there's a party, and this is an early party. This is before Foyle appears. Preston did not care for the artists, musicians, and fops. Olivia, this is his daughter, she's this ice princess, but she's an albino, completely albino, and she's blind. But she can see in the infrared. So this is, it's just, so she sees things, but she doesn't, and so she sees people, she knows people around her, but she doesn't see them the way we see them. So she's this completely different being, right? He was pleased to see a scattering of society notables this morning. There was a Sears Roebuck, a Gillette, young Sidney Kodak, who would one day be Kodak of Kodak, a Hoboken, Buick of Buick, R.H. Macy, the 16th, XVI, head of a powerful Saks Gimbal clan. Saks, S-A-K-S, right? And so many of these, it's interesting how many of these brands are still working, or just like, I think Saks just actually went into Chapter 11 a couple of weeks ago. So because they're basically working in the Thorsten Veblen sort of world of disposable income, and they're so powerful and so wealthy, they have to show how wealthy they are, right? So the way they dispose of income is they don't jaunt. The wealthy don't jaunt. They go places by car and by plane. So when 4 Mile of Ceres, which is really Gully Foyle, arrives with his 4 Mile circus, which actually is 4 miles wide, he arrives on a train. Like, there's people come, they're laying down track, and then his locomotive pulls up. It's just so wonderful. Oh my God, it's like every page is like thought, idea. It's amazing. And for media studies, oh God, it's on page 46. One of them says, where they publish the 24 Hour, which I think is called the newspaper, and it's one of them says it's 3D 5S, right? So 3-dimensional 5 senses. Oh, it's so great! It's so wonderful. But he's a clown, and the reason he becomes a clown is that nobody suspects a clown. So he's a clown, but underneath he's still this murderous brute, basically. And Bester starts the second part. He was this autodidact. He went to university and basically had just bored him. Obviously, it bored him to death. So he would go to he learned to speed read, and he would go to the New York Public Library, and just sit there and just, sort of go through these books and speed read for stuff. And he sort of collected this masses of, and then he would sort of, just cram it, make a gel into a novel. Amazing. So from Tom of Bedlam, which is an anonymous poem about a song. It's all poems were originally songs. The first poet, we think, I mean, that is in the West, Caedmon, was he was a shepherd, I think, and he was so he sang, and so most poetry came from songs, because you have to have a poem to sing a song, right? So people are like, I don't read poetry. It's like, do you listen to songs? So you do actually read poetry. So he's quoting from Tom of Bedlam. With a night of ghosts and shadows, I summoned am to tourney, have a tournament, have a lancing and jousting. 10 leagues beyond the wide world's end. He thinks it is no journey. It's just piratical, romantic. Oh, this is great. I'd forgotten about this. The beginning of part 2 is the old year's sourness, pestilence poisoned the planet. This is alliteration there. But it's also, this is a reference to a very funny patter song by Danny Kaye from, oh my goodness. It was a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, or the court jester, I guess it was called. And it's the same idea. Basically, a contemporary man is thrown back into the court of King Arthur. And they get into a patter song where they're trying to get rid of the villain. And so there are two goblets. And one of them, and each one of the goblets has a marker on it, right? Because they did this kind of thing. So one of the goblets has a pestle on it, like a mortar and pestle, the kind of thing you grind up your whatever with. I was gonna say your weed, but you probably don't grind up your weed with a mortar and pestle. Anyway, so you got your mortar and pestle, and then there's a chalice. This is going to become part of the patter song. Which has come from a different place. It's come from the palace, right? So what they have to remember, so one of them puts poison into the pestle, the chalice, the container, the drink container with the pestle on it. So what they have to remember is he has to pass this message across so that the person who their favorite doesn't drink from the poisoned vessel and die. Okay, so it comes down to this patter song where he starts off slowly and then it picks up speed. And Danny Kaye was very good at this. Oh my God. Rather than see the whole movie, which is it's very 50s. I don't know, you might enjoy it. I mean, you might get a blast from it. It's such a time capsule of, how people treated women and men. The whole interplay. The class thing, the race thing, well, not actually race, not about race, the class and gender thing. But anyway, he says they finally figure it out. The pellet with the vessel with the pestle, has the pellet with the poison. The chalice from the palace has the brew that is true. And then you have to go on remembering that. And then they all say it to each other very quickly. Anyway, so the pestilence poisoned the planets. Yeah, and it begins with this. I see Neil Gaiman wrote an introduction. Oh, don't bother reading that. This was the golden age, the time of high adventure, rich living, and hard dying, but nobody thought so. This is the future of fortune and theft, pillage and rapine, culture and vice, but nobody admitted it. Well, this is very clearly it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and it goes back to Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. So it's extremely smart, and so Four Mile reappears as this clown, and he was a wealthy young buffoon from the largest of asteroids. Fomalhav series was enormously rich. He was almost enormously amusing. He was the classic bourgeois gentilhomme, as sort of as a man of leisure but is a true gentleman, and interested in everything. Only has hobbies. Doesn't work for a living. He's a $1 a year man. The upstart nouveau riche of all time. His entourage was a cross between a country circus, the comic court of the Bulgarian kinglet, and has witnessed this typical arrival in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then he arrives. And it takes them, the whole day to set up the circus. And, wow, he even has a helicopter. A 6-motor helicopter drifted down and hovered over a giant trampoline. So it's and what he describes sort of sounds like Cirque du Soleil. It's just amazing. The odor of frying, boiling, baking pervaded the camp. Fomal's private police were already on duty, patrolling 4 acres, keeping the huge crowd of spectators back. Then by plane, by car, by bus, by truck, by bike, and by jaunt came Fomal's entourage. Librarians and books, scientists in laboratories, philosophers, poets, athletes. Racks of swords and sabers were set up and judo mats in the boxing ring. A 50-foot pool was sunk in the ground and filled by pump from the lake. An interesting altercation arose between the 2 beefy athletes as to whether the pool should be warm for swimming or frozen for skating. What could possibly come next? Bike? No roller skates. He'll come out on a pogo stick. And but he gets in a cannon and blasts him out, and so he makes his appearance. There was a bang, a black powder explosion, and Fomalhav series was shot out of the cannon in a graceful arc to the very door of his tent, where he was caught in a net by 4 valets. The applause that greeted him was thunderous. Friends, Romans, countrymen, Fomalhav began earnestly. Lend me your ears, Shakespeare. 1564 to 1616. Damn! 4 white doves shook themselves out of Fomalhav's sleeves and fluttered away. He regarded them with astonishment. Then continued. Friends, greetings, salutations, bonjour, bon temps, bon vivant, bon voyage, bon... What the hell? His pockets caught fire and rocketed forth Roman candles. Friends, shut up. I'll get the speech straight. Quiet. Friends. He looked around down in dismay. His clothes were melting away, revealing lurid scarlet underwear. Kleineman, he bellowed furiously. Kleineman, what's happened to your goddamn hypno training? You studied for this beach last night, Fomal? Damn right, for 2 hours I studied. Never took my head out of the hypno oven. Kleineman on prestidigitation. No, the hairy man bawled. How many times must I tell you? Prestidigitation is not speech making, it's magic, Dummkopf. You have the wrong hypnosis taken. Again, this is part of the sort of Borscht Belt humor of the time. And so then, this is amazing. And then there are very dark moments in it, which is really good. I mean, he's a real anti-hero. I mean, he's a real anti-hero. His greatest enemies basically have to join him because they want the same things, which is ultimately to overthrow the powers. I don't want to spoil too many. I don't want to spoil the wonderful stuff of the book. I just want you to get an idea of just how crazy this book is and how much it is a journey basically to consciousness, where let me see if I can find this, where basically he has to wake up and he has to grow up. I mean, fundamentally the book is about the human race learning to grow up, stopping with war and with the sort of predatory quality of capitalism, which makes monsters out of people. So Preston and Dagenham and all the people who sort of surround these guys who are either super wealthy or super powerful, one or the other or both, are the real monsters. And Gully Foyle, who's a bad guy. I mean, he's a rapist. He's a killer. He tortures people that he wants to get the truth out of. Basically, he awakens, and as he awakens, he comes to a better sense of what human beings can be. It's a very optimistic view of human beings. So I would go on. I mean, it's about Freud, it's about Nietzsche, it's about technological impact, it's about media. But most of all, it's this wonderful story of Gully Foyle tearing his way across basically the landscape and the starscape of the 25th century and the amazing characters that he gets involved with along the way. And